Hi, my name is Rachel, and today I'm going to be walking you through a case presentation focusing on equality in inclusive education, specifically on the discrimination of LGBTQS2S plus students against freedom of expression. I'm going to be using the Canadian Charter, the Inclusive Education Policies, and the Education Act to help us solve this case. When discussing inclusive education, we can start with the Canadian Charter. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms provides that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security, and that every individual is equal before and under the law. Also, that everyone has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination based on national or ethnic origin, race, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability. So, in the context of education, as we've learned, there's no guaranteed right to inclusion, but instead, as educators, inclusion is an attitude and approach that embraces diversity and promotes equal opportunities for all. Therefore, as teachers, we must practice inclusive education, which is also defined as the adaptation and enhancement of classroom context for students with diverse needs. So we must strive to create a welcoming, caring, respectful, and safe learning environment, and nurtures a sense of belonging and a positive sense of self. So with this in mind, any form of discrimination against inclusion of different sexual orientations in schools is not a practice of inclusive education. To review, why is inclusive education important, and how does it relate to equality? Inclusive education is a priority for us as educators, also policymakers, and society as a large, because it directly impacts the development of a diverse and equitable society. Inclusive education ensures that all students, regardless of their background, identity, or ability, have the right to a quality education that respects and values their individuality. The principle is deeply rooted in legal frameworks such as the Education Act and inclusive education policies, which advocate for an educational environment that accommodates the varied needs of learners and promotes equality and reduces discrimination. In this video, we're focusing on an equality issue, specifically the discrimination of equality on LGBTQ2S plus students and curriculum. By acknowledging and teaching about various sexual orientations in a neutral and respectful manner, schools can create an environment where students feel valued and included. In this case, we're going to explore this nature of inclusive education was broken. In this case, this group of students was marginalized and discriminated against from an opposing group's freedom of expression, creating a very multifaceted case. This is the case that we're going to be focusing on. It's called the Whatcott case. It occurred in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in 2001. William Whatcott distributed pamphlets in Saskatoon that included information on homosexuality in public schools curriculum, and they went to argue that teaching this was harmful to children. The pamphlets included hateful information on why the teaching of sexual orientations in school should not occur. In the case, it was argued that William Whatcott was using an ideological advantage to portray his religious beliefs against an opposing group. We chose to study this case because we believe it does bring to light the ongoing stressors and debates of the inclusion of this group of students in schools that is still occurring today. And this case goes to highlight unique tensions between where freedom of expression is okay and the protection against discrimination on select groups. When studying the case, we found that it did not reference any educational policies. So we are taking the case as if it were going to acknowledge educational policies, such as the Education Act and the Inclusive Education Policy. And referencing these education policies actually changes the result of the case. We will show you the actual result of the case, and we will show you the results of the case as if we were to reference educational policies. If you would like to read what was written on the pamphlets, you can pause the video now. The real result of this case is complicated. The pamphlets did lead to people complaining to the Saskatchewan Human Rights Tribunal, alleging that the content was considered hate speech and it was in violation with the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code. But the tribunal initially found that the Whatcott's pamphlets did not violate the code by promoting hate speech against individuals based on sexual orientation. Whatcott was ordered to cease distributing the material, and he had to pay damages to the people who complained. However, Whatcott appealed this decision. The case eventually reached the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal, which overturned the earlier rulings, concluding that the flyers, when viewed in full context, did not meet the legal threshold for promoting hatred as defined by previous cases. The Court of Appeals decision emphasized the importance of balancing the freedom of expression with protections against hate speech, particularly in the context of public debates on moral and educational issues. This case is significant in Canada because it highlights the challenges and complexities involving defining and regulating hate speech, especially in relation to freedom of expression. Relating this case study to the principles of inclusive education, there are two principles that we can use to argue that the actions of the pamphlets are unmoral and are a wrongdoing. The first is that they created a barrier to the learning environments and that they did not encourage students to participate. The second principle, as they did not value learner differences and students were not encouraged to feel like they belong in schools. As you can see, it can be argued again that the pamphlets were not an inclusive way of thinking and did not demonstrate universal acceptance that promotes a sense of belonging for all students and learners. The Education Act can also be used to change the result of the case. Whereas the government recognizes the importance of inclusive education and that all students are entitled to a respectful learning environment. Section 33 on board responsibilities states that the board has the responsibility to maintain a safe and welcoming environment and provide continuous support to do so. Section 3 states that all students have the right to access education. Both sections go to suggest that students, regardless of who they are and their sexual orientation, have the right to a safe and inclusive educational system. This aligns with the Act's mandate that states that every resident of Alberta has access to education, implicitly supporting environments that are non-discriminatory and inclusive. Further, this also relates to Section 16 on diversity and respect. This section of the Act supports the argument that schools need to foster understanding and respect for all individuals. As you can see, all of these points relate to creating an inclusive education environment. There are even more sections of the Education Act that refer to this as well. These are just a few. With all of this in mind, this case is critical for understanding the legal landscape surrounding equality of all teachers, teacher leaders, and students in education. So although this case dealt with the issue of freedom of expression versus hate speech protection, its implications for educational policy are really relevant to us. The court's decision, or the real result of the case, in my opinion, emphasizes the need for more public debate and discussion to bring into account educational content, which really highlights the importance of addressing moral and social issues more so with educational frameworks and policies. I believe we can obtain a better level of inclusive education when we reference our educational policies and frameworks. If educational policies and frameworks were brought to this case, the result may have changed in that it breached inclusive education, in which the freedom of expression was an overstep and it did pose hate speech to the educational system. I believe that the frameworks we discussed would address the harmful impacts and discriminations made. It would further emphasize that the behavior of the pamphlets was intolerable and directly contradicts the Education Act and all principles of inclusivity and respect. These policies advocate for an educational system that not only accommodates but also should celebrate diversity, ensuring that all students have the opportunity to learn in an environment that is respectful of their identities and background. In the end, the goal is to foster an inclusive educational landscape where students can thrive, and it really underscores the fundamental role of education in shaping a diverse and equitable society. All students deserve to feel prideful about who they are and also feel that they belong in the educational system. We're going to leave you with 3 discussion questions. Do you believe the pamphlets were an overstep on freedom of speech and should be classified as hate speech? Do you believe if this case occurred in 2024, the outcome would have been the same? And do you believe that the case result would have been different if more educational policies were referenced?